When my husband brought his mistress into our home and told me I needed to move out because I was too old and boring, he had no idea that our house was legally mine alone. A week later, he was standing at my door with a suitcase, begging me to let him stay the night. My name is Susan, and I'm 58 years old. My husband Robert and I had been married for 35 years. I worked as a high school English teacher, and he was a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant. We never had children, so we devoted ourselves entirely to each other. I truly believed he loved me as much as I loved him. Looking back, I can see that our marriage had settled into a comfortable routine over the years. We had our morning coffee together, shared dinner most nights, watched television on the couch, and took annual vacations to the same lake house we'd been renting for 15 years. It wasn't passionate anymore, but it was steady, reliable, and I thought it was love. I thought Robert was content with our life together. We had met in college when I was studying education, and he was in engineering. He was handsome, ambitious, and made me laugh. We dated for 3 years before he proposed, and I remember thinking I was the luckiest woman in the world. Our wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in my parents' backyard with close family and friends. We honeymooned in Hawaii and came home to our first apartment, ready to build a life together. For years, we were happy. We bought our first house when I was 26 and Robert was 28. It was a small starter home, but we loved it. We painted every room together, planted a garden, and hosted dinner parties for our friends. Robert was attentive and affectionate. He brought me flowers on random Tuesday afternoons and left sweet notes in my lunch bag. We talked about everything: our dreams, our fears, our plans for the future. When we decided not to have children, it wasn't because we didn't want them, but because we struggled with fertility issues for several years and eventually decided that our relationship was fulfilling enough on its own. We became the couple that other people envied. We traveled together, pursued hobbies together, and genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. Our friends would joke that we were still acting like newlyweds after 10, 15, 20 years of marriage. But somewhere along the way, without me noticing exactly when it happened, Robert began to change. Or maybe I changed. Or maybe we both changed, but in different directions. The easy conversations became harder to maintain. The spontaneous gestures of affection became less frequent. We started living parallel lives in the same house. I had my teaching schedule and book club and garden, while Robert had his work projects and weekend golf games and fantasy football league. The first warning signs started about a year ago, though I didn't recognize them as warning signs at the time. Robert began staying late at work more frequently, sometimes not coming home until after 9 o'clock. When I asked about it, he would say things like, "You know how it is with the new contracts," or "Management is really pushing us to meet these deadlines." I believed him because Robert had always been dedicated to his job, and there had been talk of layoffs at the plant, so I assumed he was just trying to secure his position. He also started buying new clothes, which seemed positive to me initially. Robert had worn the same basic wardrobe for years: khakis and polo shirts on weekends, dress pants and button-down shirts for work. But suddenly, he was coming home with stylish jeans, fitted t-shirts, and even a leather jacket that seemed completely out of character for him. When I complimented him on his new style, he said, "I figured it was time to update my look. Some of the younger guys at work have been giving me fashion advice." Robert also began paying more attention to his appearance than he had in years. He started using expensive skincare products, bought new cologne, and even began whitening his teeth. When I teased him about becoming vain in his middle age, he didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he said seriously, "There's nothing wrong with wanting to look your best, Susan. Maybe you should try it sometime." The comment stung, but I tried to brush it off. Robert had always been direct, sometimes brutally honest, but this felt different. There was an edge to his voice that I hadn't heard before, a subtle cruelty that made me question myself. I said, "Robert, that's a hurtful thing to say to your wife," but he just shrugged and said, "I'm just being honest, Susan. When was the last time you really looked at yourself? I mean, really looked? I did look at myself after that conversation, standing in front of our bedroom mirror and trying to see what Robert was seeing. I saw a 58-year-old woman with graying hair that I kept in a simple bob, laugh lines around my eyes, and a body that was softer than it had been in my 20s, but still reasonably fit. I wore minimal makeup most days and preferred comfortable clothes to fashionable ones. I had never considered myself particularly vain or high maintenance, and Robert had never seemed to mind before. But maybe he was right. Maybe I had let myself go without realizing it. When I suggested we take a vacation together for our anniversary, saying, "Honey, maybe we could go somewhere nice this year instead of the lake house," he looked at me with what I can only describe as disgust and said, "Susan, have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately? Are you really comfortable being seen in public looking like that?" The words hit me like a slap. I said, "Robert, what do you mean?" He said, "I mean that you've completely given up on yourself. Your hair, your clothes, your weight. You look like you've just stopped caring about everything." I felt tears forming in my eyes. "Robert, I haven't gained that much weight, and my clothes are fine for a teacher." He said, "Maybe they're fine for a teacher, Susan, but they're not fine for a woman who wants to go places with her husband." I started noticing other changes too. Robert would take phone calls in the garage or outside, always claiming they were work-related. But these calls often lasted for an hour or more, and I could hear him laughing in a way that he rarely laughed with me anymore. When I asked about them, he would say things like, "Just discussing the Peterson project with Tom," or "Had to walk Dave through some technical issues." But the calls were happening at odd times, Sunday mornings, late evenings, even during our dinner, together. He bought new cologne and started going to the gym, something he hadn't done consistently in over a decade. The gym membership wasn't cheap, and when I mentioned the expense, he said, "Some of us still care about staying attractive, Susan. Some of us still want to feel good about ourselves." When I asked about his sudden interest in fitness, he said, "I'm not getting any younger, and I want to stay healthy. Is there something wrong with that?" There wasn't anything wrong with it, of course, but the timing felt suspicious. Robert had never cared much about working out before. He had always been naturally slim and had maintained his weight without much effort. But now he was going to the gym 4 times a week, following a strict workout routine, and even drinking protein shakes. When I suggested that we could work out together, he said, "Susan, we're at completely different fitness levels. It would be better if we each did our own thing." The second major incident happened 3 months later. I was doing laundry and found a restaurant receipt in Robert's pants pocket. It was for Romano's, an expensive steakhouse downtown that we had only been to a few times for special occasions. The bill was for 2 people with appetizers, entrees, wine, and dessert, definitely not a quick business lunch. The total was over $200, which was more than we usually spent on a week's worth of groceries. Сокращенная версия. But when the guests started arriving, Robert intercepted me and said, "Susan, I need you to stay in the background today. I want to handle the hosting myself. Maybe you could just help with the kitchen work," he continued, "and stop monopolizing conversations with our guests. Every time I try to talk business, you interrupt with stories about your students. It's not appropriate anymore." I felt my face burning with embarrassment, especially since some neighbors were within earshot. Throughout the party, I stayed mostly in the kitchen, feeling like an outsider at my own event. The third incident was even more telling. Robert had started dressing better for work, wearing expensive cologne and getting his hair styled at a salon instead of his usual barbershop. When I complimented his appearance, he said, "Well, at least one of us is trying to look presentable." I tried to improve myself, bought new clothes, started exercising, got my hair done at the same salon. But when I showed him my new look, he barely glanced up and said, "That's nice, Susan. Maybe next you can work on your personality." I felt like I was losing my mind. Every conversation became a minefield of cruel comments. I began to suspect there was someone else, but convinced myself Robert was just going through a midlife crisis. Our physical relationship deteriorated significantly. When I suggested marriage counseling, Robert dismissed it immediately, saying, "I already know what's wrong. We've grown apart. We want different things now." But then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon in October. I came home early to surprise Robert with his favorite dinner. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar silver BMW convertible parked outside. I walked into our living room and froze. Sitting on our couch was a young woman in her mid-20s with long blonde hair, wearing a tight black dress and expensive heels. She was completely at ease, holding a wine glass, our good wine that we saved for special occasions. Robert appeared from the kitchen with 2 glasses, looking annoyed at my arrival rather than guilty. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised, just irritated, as if I were an unwelcome interruption. The young woman looked up at me with bright, curious eyes, and a smile that seemed genuine, but also somehow calculating. She didn't look embarrassed or uncomfortable at being found in another woman's home with that woman's husband. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting me. Robert set down the wine glasses on our coffee table and said, in a tone that suggested he was making a routine introduction, "Susan, you're home early. I'd like you to meet Christina. She's my friend from work." The way he said friend made it immediately clear that their relationship was anything but professional. There was an intimacy in his voice when he spoke her name, a warmth that I hadn't heard him use when talking about me in months. Christina uncurled herself from the couch with fluid grace and extended her hand to me with a bright smile. "Susan, I've heard so much about you," she said, as if meeting me was a delightful surprise rather than an incredibly awkward situation. Her handshake was firm and confident, and her voice had a slight southern accent that made everything she said sound charming and sweet. I stood there, still holding my purse and trying to process what I was seeing. I felt like I was in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. This couldn't be real. My husband couldn't be calmly introducing me to his friend in our living room while serving her expensive wine in the middle of the afternoon. I managed to say, "Robert, what's going on here?" My voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears, like it was coming from someone else. Robert picked up his wine glass and took a sip before answering, as if he needed to fortify himself for what was coming next. He said, with the calm detachment of someone discussing the weather, "Susan, we need to talk. Christina and I have been seeing each other for several months now. I'm in love with her." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my knees weaken, and I had to grab onto the doorframe to steady myself. I looked at this young woman sitting on the couch that Robert and I had picked out together 15 years ago, in the house where we had built our entire life together, surrounded by wedding photos and vacation souvenirs, and all the accumulated memories of 35 years of marriage. I said, "You're in love with her. Robert, we're married. I'm your wife." Robert's expression was cold, almost bored, as if my shock and pain were tedious obstacles to be dealt with. He said, "Susan, what we have isn't love. It hasn't been love for years. It's habit, routine, obligation. With Christina, I feel alive again. I feel like the man I used to be before I settled for this." He gestured vaguely in my direction, as if I were a piece of furniture that had gone out of style. The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. I had spent 35 years building a life with this man, supporting his career, creating a home for us, being his partner in everything, and he was dismissing all of it as settling for something substandard. Christina leaned forward on the couch, her expression sympathetic, but also slightly patronizing. She said, in that sweet southern voice, "Susan, I want you to know that neither of us planned for this to happen, but sometimes love just finds you, you know? Robert and I have such a deep connection. We understand each other in a way that's just magical." I felt nauseous listening to her describe their magical connection while sitting in my living room, drinking my wine, surrounded by the life I had built with my husband. I said, "A deep connection. How long has this been going on?" My voice was getting stronger now, fueled by anger rather than shock. Robert answered matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a business contract. About 8 months. We met when her company started doing contract work for my plant. We just clicked immediately. 8 months. For 8 months, while I was making his dinner, doing his laundry, sharing his bed, trying to be a better wife because he kept telling me I wasn't good enough, he had been living a completely separate life with this woman. I said, "Robert, how could you do this to me? To us? To our marriage?" He shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and deeply insulting. "Susan, I tried to make it work with you, but you're not the woman I married anymore. You've given up. You've stopped trying to be attractive, to be interesting, to be fun." I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm not the woman you married. Robert, you're not exactly the same man I married either. We've both aged, we've both changed. That's what happens in a marriage. That's what for better or worse means." But Robert shook his head dismissively. "No, Susan. I've grown and changed and tried to better myself. You've just gotten comfortable and complacent." Christina nodded supportively, like she was agreeing with a particularly insightful point in a college lecture. "Robert's told me so much about you, Susan. He really has tried to make things work, but sometimes people just grow apart. It doesn't make anyone the bad guy." I looked at her with amazement. "Doesn't make anyone the bad guy? You're sleeping with a married man in his wife's house, and you think that doesn't make you the bad guy?" Robert stepped between us, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "Don't blame Christina for this, Susan. This is about you and me, and the fact that we haven't been happy for years." I said, "We haven't been happy." "Robert, I thought we were fine. Yes, we've settled into routines, but I thought that was normal after 35 years of marriage. I thought we were content." Robert laughed, and there was genuine amusement in his voice, as if the idea of our contentment was absurd. "Content? Susan, when was the last time we had a real conversation about anything other than household chores or your students? When was the last time you made an effort to look nice for me, or planned something special for us to do together? When was the last time you surprised me or challenged me or made me excited to come home?" I felt tears forming in my eyes, but I was determined not to cry in front of this woman. I said, "I plan things, Robert. I cook your favorite meals. I suggest trips. I try to spend time with you. You're the one who's always too busy or too tired. You're the one who criticizes everything I do." Christina interjected gently, like a therapist trying to mediate a difficult session. "Maybe you both just want different things now. There's nothing wrong with that. People change, relationships evolve. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let someone go so they can be happy." I turned to her, my anger finally overriding my shock. "Are you seriously giving me marriage advice right now? You're 25 years old, and you're sleeping with my husband. What could you possibly know about marriage or relationships or letting people go?" Christina didn't seem offended by my outburst. Instead, she smiled sadly, like she felt sorry for me. "I'm actually 28, and I've had serious relationships before. I know what it's like when two people just aren't compatible anymore. I also know what it's like when you find someone who truly understands you." Robert nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I'm trying to explain, Susan. Christina gets me in a way that you never have. She appreciates my ambition. She supports my goals. She makes me want to be the best version of myself." I said, "I've supported your goals for 35 years, Robert. I've been to every work function, every company picnic, every awards dinner. I've listened to you talk about your projects and your frustrations and your dreams." Robert said, "You've gone through the motions, Susan. You've been physically present, but you've never really understood what I was trying to achieve. Christina works in business development. She understands the corporate world, the networking, the strategic thinking. When I talk to her about work, she doesn't just nod politely, she actually contributes ideas." I felt like I was being criticized for not being something I had never claimed to be. I said, "Robert, I'm a teacher, not a business consultant. I've never pretended to be an expert on corporate strategy, but I've always been interested in your work because it was important to you." Christina said, And that's sweet, Susan. Really it is. But Robert needs more than polite interest. He needs a partner who can really engage with his professional life, who can be an asset to his career. I stared at her. An asset to his career? Is that what you think a wife is supposed to be? Robert said, not just an asset, Susan, but someone who enhances my life instead of just existing in it. Christina makes me feel young again, energetic, excited about the future. With you, I feel like I'm just going through the motions until I die. The brutality of his words was staggering. I said, so that's what our marriage has been to you? Just going through the motions until you die? Robert said, not always, Susan. We had good years, but that was a long time ago. Now we're just two people sharing a house and a routine, and that's not enough for me anymore. I said, so what are you suggesting, Robert? That I just disappear so you can play house with your girlfriend? He looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd walked in. Not disappear, Susan. But yes, I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to live. Christina and I want to start our life together, and we can't do that with you here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You want me to move out of our home? Robert said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow student. Susan, be reasonable. Christina and I want to build a future together, and we need space to do that. It would be too awkward for everyone if you stayed here. I looked around the living room where we had hosted countless dinner parties with friends, where we had spent lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper together, where we had celebrated every anniversary and birthday for the past 20 years. This room contained so many memories of our life together. The Christmas mornings, when we opened presents by the fireplace, the New Year's Eves when we stayed home and watched the ball drop on television, the quiet evenings when we sat together, reading or watching movies. I said, this is my home too, Robert. I've lived here for 20 years. All my memories are here. All my things are here. Robert sighed impatiently. Susan, you're making this harder than it needs to be. You're a teacher. You have your own income. You have job security. You can get a nice apartment somewhere, maybe even closer to the school where you work. It might be good for you to have a fresh start, Christina added, with the enthusiasm of someone who had just thought of a brilliant solution. And Robert would help with the transition, of course. He's not trying to leave you with nothing. Maybe he could help with the security deposit on a new place, or help you move your furniture. I stared at her. How generous of you both to plan out my future for me. Robert said, Susan, don't be bitter. We're trying to handle this like adults. I could have kept sneaking around indefinitely, but I respect you enough to be honest about what's happening. I said, you respect me? Is that what this is? Bringing your girlfriend into our home and telling me to find somewhere else to live? Christina looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension. Maybe I should go and let you two talk privately about the practical details. But Robert took her hand, a gesture that felt like another slap to my face. No, stay. Susan needs to understand that this is real, that we're serious about each other. This isn't just some midlife crisis or temporary infatuation. I felt something break inside me, watching my husband hold another woman's hand in our living room. The man I had loved for most of my adult life was choosing this stranger over me, dismissing 35 years of marriage as if they had been a waste of time. I said, fine, Robert, I understand perfectly. You've made your choice. Robert looked relieved. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Susan. I was worried you might try to make things difficult. I picked up my purse. Oh, I wouldn't dream of making things difficult for you, Robert. You deserve to be happy. He smiled genuinely for the first time in months. Thank you, Susan. I know this is hard, but it really is for the best. Christina squeezed his hand. Susan, I hope someday you can understand that we never meant to hurt you. Love just happens sometimes. I looked at her in my living room, talking about love like it was fate. I said, of course not. I'm sure my pain was the furthest thing from your mind when you were sleeping with my husband. Robert frowned. Susan, there's no need to be nasty. I said, you're right, Robert. There's no need for anything anymore. I walked toward the door. I'll pack my things and be out by the weekend. Christina added, And Susan, I hope you find someone who makes you happy too. I drove to my friend Martha's house and cried for 3 hours. Martha was furious. Susan, you can't let him throw you out of your own house like some tenant. I said, Martha, what choice do I have? He doesn't want me anymore. Martha shook her head. That house is half yours. You've contributed to everything for 20 years. He can't just kick you out because he wants to play with a younger woman. But then I realized something Robert had forgotten. The house wasn't half mine. It was entirely mine. 20 years ago, my parents had given us the down payment, but insisted the house be put in my name only as protection for me. My father, a lawyer, had seen too many women lose everything in divorces. He insisted it be my separate property. Robert had been upset, but I convinced him it was just a formality since we'd always be together. Over the years, Robert forgot the ownership details. He paid the mortgage, and we called it our house, but legally, it was mine alone. His forgotten oversight was about to become his biggest mistake. I called my sister Jennifer, who reminded me of Dad's foresight. Jenny, the house is only in my name. She said, exactly. Dad was protecting you from this exact situation. Robert has no legal claim whatsoever. On Monday morning, I called a locksmith and a divorce lawyer. The locksmith changed all the locks while Robert was at work. The lawyer, Patricia Chen, smiled when I explained the ownership situation. I packed Robert's belongings in boxes, put them on the porch with legal documents showing my sole ownership, and a note. Robert, this house belongs to me alone. You are no longer welcome here. Patricia said, Susan, your father was very smart to structure the purchase that way. In this state, property that belongs to one spouse before the marriage, or is given specifically to one spouse during the marriage, remains separate property. Since your parents gave you the down payment and insisted the house be in your name only, it's your separate property. Your husband has no claim to it whatsoever. I said, but he's been paying the mortgage for 20 years. Doesn't that give him any rights? Patricia shook her head. Not unless you can prove that you had an agreement to share ownership, which would be very difficult to establish. From a legal standpoint, he's been paying rent. The fact that he's your husband doesn't automatically entitle him to property ownership. Patricia helped me draft a formal notice informing Robert that he was no longer welcome in the house, and that any attempt to enter would constitute trespassing. She also prepared a letter explaining the legal ownership of the property and demanding that he remove his belongings within 48 hours. When I got home that afternoon, I packed all of Robert's clothes, personal items, and belongings into boxes and suitcases. It was strange going through his things. The expensive new clothes, the cologne, the hair products he had been using to impress his girlfriend. I felt no sadness anymore, just a cold determination to reclaim my life and my home. I put all of his belongings on the front porch, along with Patricia's letter and copies of the deed and mortgage documents. Everything was clearly showing my name alone as the property owner. I also included a brief note of my own. Robert, as you can see from the attached documents, this house belongs to me alone. You are no longer welcome here. Please arrange to pick up your belongings and find somewhere else to live. Do not contact me except through my attorney. When Robert came home from work that Monday evening, he found his life packed in boxes on my porch and all the locks changed. My phone started ringing within minutes of his arrival, and I could see him through the window pacing back and forth on the porch with his phone pressed to his ear. I answered on the fourth ring. Hello, Robert. He was screaming, Susan, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't lock me out of my own house. I said calmly, Actually, Robert, it's not your house. It never was. Check the documents I left for you. He said, This is insane. We bought this house together. I've been paying the mortgage for 20 years. I said, Yes, you've been paying rent essentially. But the house itself belongs to me. My parents bought it for me as a wedding gift, and they were very careful to make sure it remained my separate property. Robert sputtered, But we're married. What's yours is mine. I said, That's what I used to think too, Robert. But you've made it very clear that you don't want to be married anymore. He said, Susan, this is crazy. You can't just throw me out. I said, Robert, I'm not throwing you out. You chose to leave. You brought another woman into my home and told me I should find somewhere else to live. Well, I've decided that you're the one who needs to find somewhere else to live. Robert's voice became desperate. Susan, where am I supposed to go? I don't have anywhere to stay. I said, Robert, that's not my problem anymore. You have a girlfriend who thinks you're wonderful. I'm sure she'll take care of you. Christina must have been with him because I could hear her voice in the background, though I couldn't make out what she was saying. Robert said, Susan, this is vindictive and petty. We can work this out like adults. I said, We are working it out like adults, Robert. You made an adult decision to have an affair and end our marriage. I'm making an adult decision to protect my interests and reclaim my home. Over the next few days, Robert called constantly, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, but always desperate. He would say things like, Susan, we can work this out. Maybe Christina and I can find our own place, and you and I can try counseling. I would reply, Robert, you told me our marriage was just habit and routine. You told me I was boring and unattractive. You brought your girlfriend into my home. Why would I want to work anything out with you? He tried different approaches. Susan, I know I said some hurtful things, but I was confused. I wasn't thinking clearly. I said, You seemed very clear to me, Robert. You seemed to know exactly what you wanted and who you wanted it with. He said, But I realize now that I made a mistake. Christina isn't who I thought she was. I said, What do you mean? Robert said, She's been pressuring me to leave you and marry her immediately. She wants me to sell the house and buy her a bigger one in a better neighborhood. She's not the sweet, understanding person I thought she was. I said, So you're saying you only want me back because your girlfriend turned out to be demanding? Robert said, No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I realize now what I threw away. I miss you, Susan. I miss our life together. I said, You miss the woman who cooked your dinner and did your laundry and didn't ask questions when you came home late. You don't miss me, Robert. You never really knew me. 2 weeks after I had changed the locks, Robert showed up at my door at 11 p.m., clearly drunk and carrying a duffel bag. I could see him through the peephole, but I didn't open the door. He was banging on the door and shouting, Susan, Susan, open up, I need to talk to you. I called through the door, Robert, you're drunk and you're trespassing. Go away before I call the police. He said, Susan, please. Christina kicked me out. She said she needs space to think about our relationship. I have nowhere to go. I felt a cold satisfaction. I said, That's unfortunate, Robert. Maybe you should call one of your friends. He said, Susan, all our friends were really your friends. None of them will talk to me after what I did. I said, Imagine that. It's almost like people don't approve of married men abandoning their wives for younger women. Robert's voice became desperate. Susan, I made a mistake. I see that now. Christina isn't who I thought she was. She's been using me, I said. Using you. How shocking. A young woman using an older married man. Who could have predicted that? He said, Susan, please, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, but I want to come home. I want to work things out, I said. Robert, this is my home now. You made it very clear that you didn't want to be part of it anymore. He was crying now, something I had rarely seen in 35 years of marriage. Susan, I was an idiot. I threw away everything good in my life for someone who doesn't even care about me. Please give me another chance. I said, Robert, where were these tears when you were telling me I was boring and old? Where was this regret when you were holding another woman's hand in our living room? He said, I know I said terrible things. I know I hurt you. But people make mistakes, Susan. We can fix this. I looked through the peephole at this man who had been my husband, my partner, my best friend for most of my adult life. He looked pathetic, standing there drunk and desperate, begging to be let back into the life he had thrown away. I felt nothing but cold indifference. I said, Robert, I filed for divorce last week. The papers are being served to you tomorrow. We have nothing left to fix. He said, Divorce? Susan, we can go to counseling. We can work through this. I said, Robert, you don't get to decide that now. You made your choice when you chose Christina over me. He said, but she's gone. It's over with her. It meant nothing. I said, it meant nothing to you maybe, but it meant everything to me. It meant the end of my marriage, the end of my trust, the end of my respect for you. Robert said, Susan, I still love you. I never stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly. You love me? Robert, you told me I was boring, old, and unattractive. You told me I had given up on myself. You told me that what we had wasn't love, just habit. You don't get to take that back now that your girlfriend has dumped you. Robert was sobbing now. Susan, I didn't mean any of that. I was just trying to justify what I was doing. I knew it was wrong, so I convinced myself that you were the problem. I said, well, congratulations, Robert. You convinced me too. You convinced me that I deserved better than a husband who would betray and humiliate me. He said, where am I supposed to go, Susan? I don't have anywhere to live. I said, Robert, that's what happens when you burn all your bridges. You end up with nowhere to go. He said, Susan, I'm begging you. I'll sleep on the couch. I'll stay in the garage. Just please don't leave me out here. I said, Robert, you left me out here emotionally for months while you were with another woman. Now you know how it feels to be abandoned. He said, Susan, please, I'm your husband. I said, no, Robert, you are my husband. Now you're just a stranger who used to live in my house. I walked away from the door and turned off the porch light. Robert continued knocking and pleading for another hour before finally giving up. The next morning, I found him sleeping in his car in my driveway. When he saw me leaving for work, he got out of the car and tried to approach. Robert was living in a studio apartment across town, working extra hours to pay for his rent and legal fees. Christina had not only broken up with him, but she had also started dating his supervisor at work, which made his job situation extremely uncomfortable. He had lost weight, looked older, and seemed to have aged years in just a few months. He continued to call me regularly, sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, always desperate. He said, Susan, this is insane. We were married for 35 years. That has to count for something. I said, it did count for something, Robert. It counted for everything. But you threw it all away for a few months with a woman young enough to be your daughter. The divorce proceedings were swift since I had documentation of his infidelity, and he had no claim to the house or any of my other assets. Robert's lawyer had advised him to accept the settlement I offered, which was minimal. I kept the house, my retirement accounts, and most of our shared assets. Robert got his car, his personal belongings, and half of his own retirement fund. On the day our divorce was finalized, Robert called me one last time. He said, Susan, I know you hate me, and I know I deserve it, but I want you to know that I realize now what I lost. You were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed it for nothing. I said, Robert, you're right about one thing. You destroyed it for nothing. He said, is there any chance at all, that someday you might forgive me, that we might find our way back to each other? I said, Robert, forgiveness is one thing. Trust is another. You didn't just cheat on me. You humiliated me. You made me feel worthless, and you tried to throw me out of my own home. Even if I could forgive you, I could never trust you again. Robert said, Susan, I understand that you're angry, but we had 35 good years together. Doesn't that mean anything? I said, it meant everything, Robert, but you're the one who decided those 35 years weren't worth preserving. You're the one who said our love was just habit and routine. He said, I was wrong. I was so wrong. Susan, I miss you every day. I miss our life together, I said. Robert, you miss the life you threw away. But you can't have it back. Some decisions can't be undone, and some trust can't be rebuilt.